everyone. Welcome to The Composer's Life. I'm Nadia, your host, and today we have another special guest with us. He is a Grammy winner, and Emmy nominated film composer and guitarist. He has scored dozens of award winning feature documentaries as well as TV productions for the Discovery Channel, Animal Planet, National Geographic, Telemundo, Univision, and PBS, including American Experience, Nova, Sesame Street, Arthur, and Postcards from Buster. Some of the other works he's composed for include the Miramax film Next Stop Wonderland, award-winning Gold Heart Productions' The Blue Diner, John Sayles' film Casa de los Babies, in collaboration with Mason Daring, and Francis Coppola's Tetro in collaboration with Osvaldo Golijov. His live performances include those at Carnegie Hall, the Hollywood Bowl, the Blue Note Jazz Club in New York and Tokyo, and the Lincoln Center. He has performed with some of today's most influential and respected musicians, including Gary Burton, Yo-Yo Ma, Regina Carter, Brandy Brecker, Danilo Perez, and saxophone legends Giovanni Branford Marsalis, Kenny Garrett, and Paquito de Rivera. He was also my professor for film composition at Berklee College of Music, and his name is Claudio Ragazzi. Hi, Claudio. Thank you for coming on to the podcast today.
Hi, Nadia. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks all the listeners for listening. It's great to see you. I haven't seen you in a while.
Yes, it's nice to reconnect after COVID and all of that crazy time. I'll just start with my questions, which kind of follow the outline of your life.
That's great.
Okay. So my first question is, where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and first 20 years of my life, I was there until I moved to Boston, to go to Berklee College of Music. My parents both were piano players, not professional. My mother would study piano every week and had a teacher. My father was more of a popular player. He liked Oscar Peterson in terms of jazz. He liked tango music, as well. So my brother was also a drummer. So you could say that my immediate family was really into music. So I would listen to jazz in the house, to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones from my brother, classical music, from the four Bs, Bartok, Brahms, Beethoven, Bach, and things like that. So it was in a way, I would say, a pretty good environment to open up your possibilities, your mind, in terms of it was not over the top.
When did you start playing yourself?
Well, I started playing at 9, actually, and it was my brother was 5 years older. He passed away a few years ago. So this.
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, I know, but he was a major influence, because he was really into music, bringing all this interesting music to the house. He's responsible for me listening to the first Jimi Hendrix album, which changed my life. Jimi Hendrix and the progressive rock of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Yes, and those guys. Pink Floyd, the Beatles, Rolling Stones. You go, and then he made the transition to Chick Corea and the jazz fusion of the Mahavishnu Orchestra and people like that. So I was just, sometimes I would be just sleeping, on a Saturday morning, and I wake up to these sounds, and I say, what is that noise, Excuse me, what was the question again? I'm sorry.
When did you first start to?
It's a long story, you know. So so he was a drummer, and all his friends were guitar players. So there was a guitar in the house, and I actually, started playing guitar. At one point, I was not going to school a lot. You know, I was trying to find. Oh, I don't feel well. Blah blah blah. Whatever. I was horrible student in my elementary years, and I would stay home and practice. Put the TV on with no volume or little volume, and practice my scales, my arpeggios, the whole thing. It was always very eclectic. I would try to learn classical and rock and jazz. And I had many interests. Shortly after that, in my elementary school, early on, I became sort of like the musician in the school. You
Mm,
know,
mhm.
that was really nice. Because I would be in the middle of a class or something, and they, the music teacher or someone, oh, we have this assembly, very important assembly next week. Can we take Ragazzi out of your class? And that was really good. And in some cases, I mean, guitar is very popular all over the world, but in some cases, I would play like the intro, and then 20 other kids playing the strumming or whatever. I mean, so I was lucky that way, that early on, I felt sort of like supported. Again, not over the top. My mother was not saying, you gotta, study your lesson. I was actually having fun with it, so it was good. Yeah.
So, did you play guitar because of your brother's friends, do you think? Or just because it was there in the house?
I think so. I think so. And also, I mean, at first, I would say from 9 to 11, I played, right? But when I turned 11 was when I heard Jimi Hendrix, for the first time. And I can tell you exactly the record that it was a Saturday morning, and I heard these sounds. I couldn't believe it. So at 11, I got really into practicing, so I wasted 2 years of my life, Nadia. I could have started earlier. No, but at that point, it was when I started thinking about taking guitar lessons and stuff like that.
Well, maybe if you hadn't had those 2 years, who knows? Maybe you wouldn't have even played guitar.
You know what? I think, and it's the conversation we were having earlier today. You still have to have fun. You can't. It's music. You know what I mean? I mean, it should have a level of lightness and communication and spontaneity, in the sense of it's not. It should. You can make a point to say that it's a science, but if you treat it as science, it's not going to sound like music.
I definitely know from trying to do compositions at Berklee, from like theory standpoint. Never turned out quite as
It's
musical and
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
You ended up going to Berklee to study. So what kind of led you to make that choice in your late teens? What were you?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I was lucky in the sense that there was a group of kids. Argentina was going through a really tough military junta, like a military dictatorship. When I was a kid, and some of the institutions in the country, like conservatories and places like that, were very traditional, right? So, and I had more of an eclectic vision. I mean, I liked from an early age. I liked people like Paco de Lucia, the flamenco guitar player, Jimi Hendrix, Joe Pass, guitar player, Steve Howe from Yes. I mean, it was all over the place. So it's like an ADHD of the guitar world. It was all over the place, and that's so. And then Argentinian music as well, folklore and tango, as well as Brazilian. I liked a lot of the Brazilian players. Baden Powell, Sebastião Tapajós, so many great guitar players. The guitar is a world on its own, and it touches deep cultural roots of you can go. There's a record that is called From Madagascar to Memphis, right? And it's like you got people in Africa doing amazing stuff with different techniques. People in India, even, playing all the microtones and stuff. And then the blues, and then you got folk, and you have flamenco, and I mean, the guitar is not, you can't play all the music. I
Mhm.
mean, I guess many instruments are like that, but I think guitar is especially eclectic. If you want to really inhabit that world, if you really want to get deep into that. So I was really into, at one point I was really into classical as well, and I had a really good classical guitar teacher, and he was pushing me to do early on some of the concerts and the how you call it, when competitions and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
you know and I didn't like, I never really auditioned ever. I mean, I realized that I auditioned later on, when people were calling me to play a gig or something. But I didn't like that, and that was only one part of what I wanted to do. The classical. Also, the technique is very different because you play one technique for classical, another technique for flamenco, another technique for Brazilian, and then the pick, you play blues and funk and jazz and everything with completely different techniques. So at one point I had many pockets of information, since there was no institution that I could find, at least at that time, in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. So I had a really good jazz guitar player that was really into Joe Pass and Jim Hall and all, great jazz players. Then I got my classical guitar. Then I had my rock band. Another thing that was always interesting in my life was that every time I learn a new chord or a new program or a new tune or something, I would write something in that style. So composition and playing, composing, and performing was always very organic. Was never there was not this rule of, oh no, you're a composer, no, you're a guitar player, no, you are a rock guitar player, you're a jazz guitar player. No, you just, it's music. So in that sense, it was refreshing to have both. Acquire some knowledge and then put it in practice. There was a kid in our neighborhood, or our group of friends, that early on got the Berklee method, for guitar and harmony. So in those days, we had a group study groups. Instead of going to school, I had multiple study groups. Like, one was the classical thing, the other one was the jazz thing, the other one was more fusion. Then I had another group. We would get together and study 12 tone music, um, and write our, our rows, 12-tone rows and stuff like that. Then I was studying also harmony with another really good teacher. So it was a full time thing,
It's like you made your own
Yeah,
university kind of.
yeah. We made our own thing, which was, I think, thinking back, it was almost dangerous in those days for the military government, because anyone that was young, with long hair, carrying an instrument and some books, going around town, was a suspicious character, you know. Because there were, at that time, also there were other, for example, there were certain philosophies that they were not being taught in the universities. So people will do the same thing to learn some of the German, philosophies, some of the, the Marx and the, whatever, the Russians and the Americans and this and that. I mean, there were some authors that were not allowed. Yeah, you couldn't. You have a book by just a book by some author, and they. So it was a tough time in that sense. So I started to get introduced to the Berklee method when I was, I say, 14 to 17. We were getting together, playing the duets, from the uh, analyzing, I mean, the modes and the 1, the 4, the 5, the 6 minor, whatever, all that stuff. So by the time I got to Boston, one of the things about Berklee, I think, is you gotta know the if you're gonna go to Berklee, you need to know the language, the Berklee language, sort of like the way we look at harmony, and the substitutions and the secondary dominants, and blah blah blah, and all that.
And you already knew it.
I knew some of it. You
Yeah.
know what I mean. I knew. We made.
You had studied from the Berkeley
Yeah, yeah.
resources.
So by
So
the time I got to Berkeley, I was lucky to have a couple of things under my belt already. One was that at 17 I started playing in a progressive tango group, which we were playing. I was playing like a Gibson Les Paul, like distorted, and we were playing like arenas, and stuff, big concerts with the big rockers. Rock and roll in Argentina is huge.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's so many documentaries on people like the Rolling Stones. They're the way they get welcome, in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, it's like Beatlemania. It's back to the '60s. Groups like the Ramones, groups like whatever, the Police, this, and I mean, people love that music. We were playing these big concerts, but playing like tango fusion, with the bandoneon, is it, the squeeze box, the bandoneon, like an accordion type of instrument, and drums, and guitars, and keyboards, and stuff. It was great stuff. So I had that experience, the experience of recording in my own country, performing, having my own group, and study. So I think I was pretty well prepared, when I got to Berkeley. And I would recommend anyone that is listening. The school is probably 100 times more expensive now than it was when. So if you're gonna go to a place like that, you got to learn this. You have to go prepared. You know, I would say that as a general thing, because then if not, you're gonna be sort of like wasting time and money. And and you're gonna be missing a lot of. of what.
What you
Yeah,
have there.
yeah.
When you went to Berklee, did you study film scoring or were you studying guitar?
No, I didn't. I got to Boston, and before I started Berkeley, I got in touch with this guitar player, Berkeley guitar teacher. Yeah, that somebody said, "Oh, he's the guy who he taught." I think he taught. He had like Aldi Meola and John Scofield, whatever. He had all these star students, and I was taking private lessons with him before classes started, and basically he said, "Man, if you're gonna play, if you want to play, move to New York and play. You don't need to know all this other stuff. Just go and play and sit in and whatever. So I said, no, I really want to learn music. I want to learn. And in those days, I would say now is a lot more industrial, a lot more technical. Berkeley has become more pop in a way. But in those days, it was a jazz school. It was the concept of Berkeley was that they were going to teach you how to think as a jazzer, as a jazz player, and I was really into the music of people like Charlie Mingus and Duke Ellington, you know Miles Davis, Gil Evans, people like that. And you gotta know your stuff to write it's just pretty complicated, uh, especially if you want to be an orchestrator. So I went to Berkeley to study jazz composition, right? And I think I had amazing teachers because the school, that was the focus of the school. You know, I mean, I studied with, back then there was this guy Michael Gibbs. Michael Gibbs was an English composer and orchestrator. He had worked with John McLaughlin on orchestral albums. Apocalypse was one of them. Had worked with Johnny Mitchell, Jaco Pastorius, a whole bunch of people, and with him, I studied orchestration with another person by the name of Herb Pomeroy. He was really into the music of Duke Ellington, and it was a pretty tough classes. I mean, it was the type of classes that you have to audition to get in. I was lucky that way because I was, as I'm saying, I was back then prepared, so I was able to get into to pass the core curriculum. Berkeley in those days was a lot more open to accept, the knowledge that people had from before, right? So you could do your whole career in 4 semesters or 6 semesters instead of the 8 semesters.
Mm,
You know what I mean?
yeah, it was flexible.
Yeah. So I was able to get into the big band classes. I was writing for big band, for large ensemble, and as I'm saying, there were some amazing. I think there's still amazing teachers. It's different now because I'm one of them, and you don't think you think that your teachers are better than the ones your students have, right?
Mm.
What I mean is like your teachers are your masters, that they
Mm.
have a special place in your life if you're lucky to have good teachers, and then to think of yourself as
Being one of those.
that instrumental in the evolution of someone is like, I don't think my teachers thought that they were, what I mean,
Masters. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, they
Mhm.
were.
It's weird to take that place of what you thought of your teachers at the time.
But the bar is really high, in terms of, especially at a place like Berkeley. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I bet the pressure was is high sometimes.
The pressure is very high, and it's getting out of control in general. For not only for music but everything else. People these days, you need to know, if you're going to be a doctor, even you need to know computers too. You need to do your medical, uh, how you call it,
School.
no, I mean, not only you need to know medicine, but you also need to work in the computer, and with the programs and the whole thing.
Mm,
In music is the same thing. It's not only knowing music, but it's also all the technology that is involved, the studios, the computers, the sequencers, the shortcuts and Pro Tools and this and that, and then on top of that, the business part as well. So it is pretty demanding that way, and we're humans. You know what I mean? I mean, people can break.
yeah. Especially when you're not prepared for an environment like that.
Even when you're prepared, because I mean, I felt when I was at Berkeley, I felt I was on top of the world. You know what I mean? Even when you think you're well prepared, because I thought I was, this big shot. We recorded an album before graduating. We went to Los Angeles, and I had a band. We recorded an album. We were doing, Berkeley Performance Centers every semester with my band. You know, which is like sort of like. But guess what? You say that even in your program here, Berkeley Performance Center. What is that? Nobody cares. You know,
Yeah.
you could be the big shot at Berkeley. You cross Massachusetts Avenue, which is the street, and people don't know where Massachusetts Avenue is. I mean, it's just half a block. Cross that avenue, nobody knows, nobody cares. Nobody cares that you got an A on that you're studying with blah blah blah. That nobody cares. If they care about something, is okay. Play me something that sounds like music.
Yeah.
So as I graduated, and I got, it's a huge responsibility now, because I got students that they break during class, and anxiety, and this and that, and they have to take time off. My time off had to happen after I graduated, you know, because I thought, well, I was on top of the world, and then I go out in the world. Nobody knows. They don't even care, that you took 12-tone techniques with men in Argentina. Nobody wants to hear that. Who cares? It means something to us, maybe, but what I'm saying to you is like, one way or another is very demanding. People need to take care of themselves in order to make beautiful music too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's this interview of Alexander Desplat, that where they're in his studio, right? And then they're asking him, oh, tell me all about the technology, and what programs do you use. And he says, well, this is the most important piece of equipment I have. And he points out to a sofa. And the guy, the interviewer goes like, what? And he basically says, well, when I'm overwhelmed, I take a 20-minute nap, and then ideas start to happen again. So, good.
Yeah.
French. You have to be French for that.
Yes, it's true.
I mean, this is a guy that makes 7 movies a year, so I don't think he's slowing down. And he probably doesn't have a lot of assistants. I mean, he does the work himself. So something to be said about that. Yeah.
So after you left Berkeley, you took a break from music for a bit?
I took a little break. Yeah, I took a little break. And then little by little, I started to reconnect with the music that I liked. Yeah. I think, again, in a lot of these institutions, there's a lot of pressure of saying, "Oh, you got to listen to this, you got to listen to that," and sometimes it's good information, but sometimes you just don't feel like listening to that music. And music is like food. If you eat bad, not bad food, but if you eat food that is not good for your soul, you're not gonna feel good. So in that sense, I started to reconnect with the reason why I was doing music. And then around that time also, I was um, I was performing. I was also recording. There was a lot of recordings and a lot of production being made in New York, in Boston in those days. Just things like, for example, the Pat Metheny group were based in Cambridge here in Boston. So there was a lot of activity. And then I married the mother of my child, and she was a television producer, right? And I was already doing music for documentaries and all that, but I became part of a community. That was a very essential thing for me in terms of my professional life, right? I became the musician in a mostly filmmaking artistic, yeah, community. So everybody else was an editor. They were filmmakers, camera people, even choreographers and stuff like that. So I was doing a lot of different things, for theater or for friends and television and all that. And that became, so my big bang era ended abruptly, and I had to, and I had to work like everybody else. And I mean, the way I feel about work is that you don't. I was really open to the possibilities. Some people say, "No, I'm not a film composer. I want to play my music, blah blah blah," and they don't accept that. But I was open to say, "No, what's wrong? I can write music for television, for documentaries, for film, for a choreographer, or for whatever.
So you took a break, you kind of got back into it, and then your wife was a producer. So you kind of, is that when you first got introduced to the film scoring world?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. I was a musician, right? And I also, from a very early age, I grew up at a time where we used to go to see films for their directors. You know, So you don't go to see an Al Pacino or a Julia Roberts film. You go to see Robert Altman. You go to see Fellini. You go to see Godard. You go to see Woody Allen. Whatever, you know what I mean. Francis Ford Coppola. You name it. I mean, it was a generation of directors that they were making. Was a very exciting new art. The moving of pictures. I mean, already art was very established, and photographs were becoming, in the early part of the 20th century, an art. And now these moving pictures were becoming an art, too. So I remember like going to see, masters like, Stanley Kubrick, or, I mean, you would see everything, all these movies by amazing directors. Life changing films, in many ways, for someone that was, 14 or 15 or 16 or whatever, right? And then on top of that, you got all the Latin American cinema and the European cinema, and all that. To be honest with you, I was not paying too much attention to the music, which I think is a good thing. You know what I mean? I think the first, it has to be a good story. It has to be a good film. If the actor is famous, great. If not, who cares? I mean, we used to see films where people like Dustin Hoffman or Robert De Niro were unknown back then. You know what I'm saying? It's like Al Pacino was unknown. Before The Godfather, nobody knew who he was. A lot of these kids actually were coming to Cambridge here to the ART. Many of them were being trained by theater directors, and there was a connection between the American Repertory Theater here in Boston, Cambridge, and then these schools, the big acting schools in New York. So what I'm saying that is that it was actually, and I ask sometimes my students, what was the first film? Many of them say, whatever, could be E.T. for someone, could be, for me was The Mission, actually. The Mission is a film with Robert De Niro, Jeremy Irons. The music by it was by the music of The Mission was by Ennio Morricone, and it's an amazing score. Even today, this score, in a way, it was fusion, because in this score he's mixing Latin American rhythms with choral music from sort of like Christian, Catholic repertoire. So it's a mixture of imagine like Bach chorals with batucada from Brazil and Andean music from Peru and Bolivia and stuff. And it has a beautiful, beautiful melody, the oboe theme, the Gabriel's oboe. If you haven't heard it, or if people want to just uh, go into that, Gabriel's oboe solo is a beautiful piece. I mean, people talk about Cinema Paradiso, which is a great score as well. So I went on the sort of like the back side. I was interested in music as music, film as film, directors, cinema, whatever we used to call it, more like a more a fancy name than movies. It was not so much entertaining. I was never into entertainment, to be honest with you. I mean, ping pong is a better entertainment. You know what I mean? It's like
Then movies, you mean?
than art.
Oh, yeah.
I
Just
don't.
as entertaining.
I can't, like, if I'm doing the dishes, I can't put music. Like background music.
Yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
it's weird that way, but you get used to it. Sometimes if there's background music. I mean, and then I was lucky that my job was writing music for visuals, basically, for television, for films, for documentaries, and stuff like that, which provided me with a couple of things. One was that I was never into airports and hotels, like the live people that are just players and they go on the road for months. I want to have my mate or my coffee, you know. If I had when I had a dog, walk the dog or have dinner with my family, with my wife, whatever. And also in those days, which is not that long ago, the industry has changed a lot. And if you were especially a television writer, you would get a nice royalty check every every month, pretty much. So what I'm saying is that the industry was different. It was there was a benefit of the more you put out there, the more you're going to get back from royalties and stuff like that. Now my royalty check doesn't pay for you know
Really?
not even for the water for white rice. No, royalties had come down a lot for many people. For many people, not for everybody. But if you were lucky enough to benefit from that system, that was a big part of your income too.
What brought you back to Berkeley? When did you start teaching again? Did you want to teach?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it was. I graduated, Nadia. This is. I don't think your grandparents were alive then. There was the 1980s. 1984. I was at Berkeley from 81 to 84. I graduated in 84. Around, I would say, it took me a few years, but around 89, 1989, I started really working steady, going from one film to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And that period lasted around 20 years, from 89 to 2010. In the early part of 2010, was 2009 or 2010, they made like a master class at the Berkeley Film Scoring. To be honest with you, for those 20 years, I had lots of friends that were teaching at Berkeley. That, oh, you got to come teach with us, blah, 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 the whole thing. Even for rehearsals, I would try to avoid going to the school, you know?
Oh, really?
I really did. I had a 26-year break from 84 to 2010, right? I needed a break, but I was always in touch with all the players in my band, or musicians, and then you hire someone is a Berkeley professor or whatever. But I was not part of. Many of my friends graduated in 84, 80, 80 something, and they went right into teaching.
Hmm.
Which personally I think they did great. They're happy people.
Mhm.
But in my opinion, it's good to get out of the school. I personally think, but people don't have to agree. Getting out of academia, in other words, make your own mistakes. Make your own mistakes in the sense that, say, I'm going to try this. Not like some professor tells you, oh, you got to do this thing, and if you don't do this, you're going to get an F or whatever, right? Make your own mistakes, and then learn from it. I mean, what is the worst thing that could happen? They're gonna fire you. Usually, the gig that you want to get fired from, you're never gonna get fired from that one. You know what I'm saying? The one that you're saying, please fire me. They're gonna tell you, no, we got a new cut and we got a new deadline and the whole thing. I was working a lot as a film composer. 2009, they have this like a symposium. I would say it was sort of like a symposium. They invited different composers to talk to the students, and they invited me because I was one of the people that was pretty busy in town. And then it was the chairperson in those days, Don Wilkins, who sort of is the one who started the film scoring program back in the 80s, late 70s, I believe. He said, oh, we'd like your presentation. Would you be interested in doing a master class? So then I went to a classroom, that big classroom where we used, the same classroom, same chairs. 268, at 150 Mass Avenue, if you remember.
I remember it well.
You know that room.
Hmm.
And I did a presentation. I liked it, and then they said, well, there was an opening for a full time position. I made a few months later. I made a presentation in front of the professors, and they hired me. I started teaching in September 2010. So it was a 26-year break from Berklee. And part of that was maybe 20, 22 years of doing music for films, and then again I was very lucky in the sense that you go from one project to the next. you know I never had to be calling, oh, do you need a composer, all that stuff. I mean, if you want to talk about it, there's ways of trying to avoid that. My way, particular way, was trying to be, or not trying to be, but just the fact that I was able to be a member or a part of a community of different artists. The musicians came when I called them. You know what I mean? I mean, it's like at home. For many years, it was a crazy group of filmmakers and jazz musicians and stuff like that. I mean, but I mean, it sounds better than it is. You know what I mean? Then at the end of the day, you have your broccoli or whatever, macaroni and cheese. You know what I mean?
Still a normal person.
Yeah, you still. So 2010, the department was very small compared to what it is right now. You know, and my first class, I had this amazing group of students. I mean, some of these kids are teaching now in at Valencia. One of them she's the youngest chair ever. uh, Amparo, amazing composer, and as well a French horn player. So we got an amazing community of very talented people from all over the world. And I think it goes back to the conversation we were having before, where is in general we are all these gems. We were probably the best garage band in our neighborhood. We were, a family like, oh,
Amazing.
in our school we were, and all these people go to Berkeley. But Berkeley is different, because Berkeley is deals with music that is going on today. It's not a conservatory. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite project or TV show or film that you worked on during that 20-year period?
I had many that were favorite for different reasons, right? A One of them was this movie Next Stop Wonderland, because it meant, for me, was a game changer. Was actually one of my first feature films. And then we went to Sundance, and then the film became like a big deal at Sundance, talking about 1998. You know what I'm talking about? So this is more than 20 years, really. And then Harvey Weinstein, the loving character, he loved the film, right? And we were all staying in this little house in Park City, but for Sundance, each one had a room, whatever. This guy's like, oh, he wanted to pay something like 10 times the money that it cost. So it was a great project, that movie, because it went from an independent film from Boston that we recorded here, that had some money to produce a decent score. Pretty good. I mean, they paid for the musicians and the studio and the whole thing. Then we go to Sundance. It became a Miramax film, right? And then Harvey Weinstein was famous for many different things that I'm not joking. This is very serious. Whatever is horrible stuff that is going, and it was going on in Hollywood for for many many years, and it still needs to be checked. But he also will buy these independent films and will usually change the ending and change the music, right? He kept changing the ending, but he liked the music that I wrote. So I got hired to rewrite the ending of this movie like 6 times or something like that. But not with the independent film, budget. Now it was Miramax. Then eventually Miramax disbanded. We know the story, and then Sony bought Miramax, and some of the music uh, went to be part of the Sony catalog now, right? And they reuse some of those cues for other movies. So actually, there's a particularly one cue that was used in the Independent, then reused in the Miramax film, then used for a Jack Nicholson film. Something's Gotta Give, that was used there, and then used again for another romantic comedy, whatever. I don't remember the name. That's a project that I remember because it was a game changer and also a very profitable gig. The other thing that I remember a lot is working for children programming here. I was for many years. I was the composer. I had to compose songs and a background instrumental. The dramatic score. It was a series that was very active from 2003, 2004 to 2010, right? So it was a chunk of years, lots of work. It involved, it was Arthur, but
I grew up watching Arthur.
it was a different, it was Buster is as Arthur's best, and he had his own show now.
Yeah, I remember that show too.
It was the best gig I done in my life
Mm.
because every it was a lot of work, but every show opened with a song, and then you have the score, and then you have the closing song, and then all the actors were Canadian. They were French Canadian, usually from Montreal. So every couple of weeks I would have to fly to Montreal. In From Boston to Montreal is like 45 minutes, whatever, flight, an hour, whatever, and record these crazy French Canadian actors, really great, singers and stuff. I was the funnest thing. I had to stay in this petit hotel in Old Montreal, which is, the food was horrible. No, I loved it. Because as they say, you go to Quebec. Quebec for Bostonians is cheap Europe. It's cheap. Instead of flying to Europe, you go to Quebec City or to Montreal, and it's like nice. Food is great, wine. It treats you like a human being. And that. So for many years, I was doing that. It was really fun because my daughter is probably your age, maybe I'm not sure. Uh, so she was the right age for that show. So I would show her the song, right, with the guitar, and then she would, and then we record it, and then she sees the song on television. So it was a pretty cool thing in that way. I love that gig. It's not the most, I don't know, how you call it. It's not like, oh, Coppola or whatever, De Niro, you know. It's not Hollywood, but it was such a good gig. And on top of that, children programming, talking about royalties, they show this. They play the same show 5 times a day in each city in the United States.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean the gig you want to get is the Teletubbies. Teletubbies is the gig because it's a 30-minute show, but it's really a 15-minute show. In the middle of the show, Tinky Winky, whoever, says, play it again, and they play the whole show again. Do you remember
I
that?
remember that now, yes.
You are watching for 30 minutes a 15-minute show. In the middle of the show, they say, play it again. They play the whole thing. As a composer, you get paid for all those cues again, and they're showing that all over the world. That's the gig I want to have when I grow up, Nadia.
Yeah, I never thought about that.
With the music for the Teletubbies.
That's the dream job,
Oh my goodness. Do you know how hard it is to write 15 minutes of music?
especially for the Teletubbies. So, when you started teaching at Berklee, did you sort of transition from composing for TV and stuff and teach more, or?
Well, what happens is this. It's an interesting process because when you're a freelance, right? When you're freelancing, your job is getting the job. Your job is like it's like a fisherman. You're a fisherman. You gotta go out with your you got with your boat, and you gotta go fishing. You gotta go all day fishing, and one day you're gonna catch more fish than the other. But you gotta get out there, right? So without knowing it, you're always networking. You're always in the scene. You're doing stuff. When you start teaching, or when at least when I started teaching, there were two things. One, I had to catch up, because it's a lot of Berkeley. Teaching composition ideally should be one on one or should be very small groups. Sometimes when you have a class with 16, teaching composition to 16 students, you got to get used to that. Is a different story, because you want to be able to. I can't tell you the same thing, give you the same feedback that I'm giving, some other person in the same class. Very different issues. So on one hand, I had to catch up, get in the groove of teaching, not in a one to one, but in an institution. Then on the other hand, you got your salary, you got a check coming in every 2 weeks. So the incentive of finding more work diminishes. At least that did to me. And then the other thing is also that times change. A lot of this, I was doing documentaries, I was doing some commercials as well, and the money was pretty good for commercials back then. And then the royalties from television was better than now. I think they're starting, some composers from Netflix and all that are starting to get a little closer to a fair share of what, but it's never going to be what the networks were paying even public television. But some people are getting good deals in the Hulu's and Netflix and all that. Yeah, streaming platforms and stuff. So there were two things. One was that I had been doing that for 20 something years already. I really got into teaching. Teaching gave me also the opportunity to go back to my performing life,
Mm.
to go back and say, well, I'm just going to write this piece of music because I wanted to be. 17 and a half bars long. You know, I don't want a director telling me, no, I don't like the flute there or whatever. You know what I mean? No, nothing wrong with that. It, I did it, for almost whatever, 20 something years. So teaching gave me the freedom to go back to my own music, to play, put my band together again, do a couple of records, whatever, perform a little more, get in touch with talented people like yourself, and it's a different age also for me. So I think for our generation to be in touch with the younger generation is such a gift. You have no idea. It's really great. Because you guys are rocking. And you come up with all these different ways of dealing with things. Open mind. I mean, one of the things you need to be as a composer is open minded. And I think your generation, for many things in terms of technology, in terms of gender, fluidity of cultures and gender and art and music and this and that, is very open minded. I was born 100 years.
In another century.
I was, you were born were you born in another city?
I was too, yeah. Is there anything that you want to talk about Berklee or
Well, I mean, there's one thing that I think is we're gonna have to see how we deal with that, especially in this country, which is social mobility. In a way, in the United States, more than in other countries, ways of moving from one reality to a better reality was through education, right? And you had many very bright people being able to go to very expensive Harvard and other institutions, and not necessarily Harvard, but other institutions, to get a proper education and to live a better life, right? I think the personally, I mean, my only comment in general is like this standard of living and the prices that you pay tuition for, especially for art school. Tuition for art school or tuition for to become a musician is not related to, in general, to what the common musician is going to make for the rest of their lives, unless you become that 1% or 2% of the working population that is doing the really good gigs. So I think there's hopefully we will find a way of dealing, especially with the combination of education and also the health system, because they're also they're both connected. I mean, you go to a university and a lot of kids are getting sick sometimes, because of the pressures and because of the long hours. People don't eat, people don't sleep. They live with another 20 roommates or whatever,
trying to make it?
and then so is we gotta hopefully, if we could find a way. And I I'm not an administrator, in that sense. I'm a musician, and I'm a teacher, right? And I want to keep it that way. But it is a very hard time to deal with the you know expensive tuition, poor health system, and the combination of both, and expensive living conditions. Because renting an apartment in Boston or in London for that. I mean, New York, whatever, is out of control. So, so as a composer, what are the two things you need to write a decent piece of music? Besides your talent and your imagination and all the good things, you need quiet. You need silence. You need to be in a room, quiet, with a piano or with a computer, with a guitar, trumpet, whatever you want to, singing. But you need some quiet. You know what I mean? And if you're going to school and you got another six musicians living with you, how are you gonna write a decent piece of music? Even you can have the biggest headphones in the world, but it's I think it's a little complicated. So we gotta go back at some point. Somebody, I don't know. We all have to figure out what is the best thing of doing things. What without going into the online world, because I still think that we need to feed from each other.
It's completely different to be in a classroom and be listening, you know, to even practice rooms, people playing their instruments live, things like that, than
Once you get deep into composition and production, is all about energy. We're not dealing with notes. We're not dealing with sound really. We're dealing with energy, right? Is the transposition from whatever energy somebody has, some imagination, some idea, into the other person, right? And and that's very hard to do. I think we're getting used to it a little more. Talking. I think if someone from a different planet look at us, even us right now, and says, "What is this guy doing? Talking to a machine?" Because they don't see you. So we're getting better at it, thanks to COVID, I guess. Right, one of the good things. But we gotta be able to get back to be in the same room and to disagree in person, you know, to say, hey, I don't, well, what are you going to do? You know, the greatest bands are, in the world were people that were very different, and they had horrible fights, Yeah. Happens in the best families. Yeah.
what is one of the biggest things that you hope your students take away from you when you're teaching?
Oh, that's a tough one. Hopefully inspire, hopefully if I can help in contributing for whatever piece of music you're writing to be a little better, right? Or to sound better, or to look at it from a different perspective, or to say, yes, that's don't touch it, it's perfect, or it's not perfect, but don't touch it, don't ruin it, if that would be something great. I don't know. I think that's, yeah, that's to inspire, to help in any way, in with whatever way I can. Yeah.
Well, I don't really have any more questions that I planned. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add in the interview or discuss.
I do want to thank you for the invitation. I want to wish you, best of luck with this project and all the other projects that you're doing, your music, and your new life, and all your projects. Keep dreaming. It's interesting to see. I mean, I am surrounded with all these guitars and equipment, and you get a house, and then eventually your kids go to school or whatever, and then when you realize that it's all part of a dream. You know what I mean? I mean, in my case, it was all about trying to be a musician, try to write music, and try to play music. It's part of a dream. So materialize your dream, whatever the dream is. Is always worth it. You know what I mean? It's always worth it, because your dream, for sure, your dream is going to be different than someone else. You could be sleeping for 100 years with this next to your husband, wife, whatever. You're going to be dreaming separate dreams. You could be next to each other and in different worlds too. So what I'm saying is that if you can be true to your dream and try to materialize it, it is possible. It is possible to make it, whatever the things that people have. You need. So that is that, in and I say that in the sense of, for people that are not supported by their families or the society or whatever. It could get tough sometimes at any age. It's not the easy road, but then you realize that there's no easy road, right? Because if you don't believe on being an accountant, or a real estate agent, you're gonna have a horrible time too. So better materialize your dream and stick to it. Be realistic. Being true to your dream doesn't mean um, being an extremist either. Being like extreme and, oh no, I'm never gonna play an F sharp. 11 notes in my vocabulary.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed getting to know you more. Thank you so much for everyone listening today. We hope you enjoyed this interview, and I'll see you next time on The Composer's Life.